All right, so for those of you, thanks for coming back. I believe, yeah, I know. I believe that's the worst part of the whole study in terms of, yeah, right? I think we have to get through it, though, in the sense of trying to understand. We're not asking anybody to believe in something based on, trust me, okay? We're not asking people to say, well, just have blind faith and you'll get there, okay? We're saying there's actually a reasonable approach to understanding the truth and the reality of the world that we live in, and we think that we can use those rules of logic and ration and reasoning and inductive discussions to say, well, the philosophical assertions of Kant and Hume don't stand on their own merits, okay? And therefore we should be well set up on a path to understand and walk through how do we get to reality. How can we possibly understand reality, okay? So just because, and that's why if you ever hear me say, I've said it before at some point in time, you know, I totally agree with Paul, you know, that what we see in the world is a vain, empty philosophies, right? This is what we have, vain, empty philosophies, trying to explain truth and reality by avoiding truth and reality, okay? And so we have these philosophical things. We have to deal with it because, you know, there are people who go to college and they go to college and they study philosophy and they champion Kant and they champion Hume and a variety of other philosophers and philosophical systems. Didn't get that out properly, and we have to deal with that. But here again, we think we can just, you know, generally speaking, conclude, no, it's a effort of working through the observable evidence to know and understand the world we live in has purpose, has design, it has been given to us as a way that we can explore truth and compare it to what we see and understand how the world is function and whether there's any person or God behind its existence. So with that, I'm gonna jump in here. In chapter 3, they move into the sciencey stuff, okay? And they use this acronym SURGE. I'm going to go over it in brief detail, and then I'm going to tell you why I'm going to diverge from the book quite significantly in this section. But let me just cover what they talk about in the book. Most of us probably know about Einstein, and most of us probably know that he proposed both a special and a general theory of relativity, which ultimately has been proven to 5 decimal places of accuracy in terms of various things like everything in Einstein's mind and what seems to be observable reality is that everything is relative. Time, space, matter, energy, all of these things are relative. Meaning, and in fact, you know, if I could had all the technical knowledge I could tell you, but if you've ever heard of an atomic clock, right? Atomic clocks, that's where we get most of our time synchronization on our watches and phones and all that kind of stuff. It's not just somebody, you know, putting little clicks, you know, design a super accurate little click. It's actually using, you know, atoms to determine clock time. And there's a clock at Greenwich, England at sea level, and there's a clock at Boulder, Colorado, and they are offset by the distance and altitude because time is faster at a higher altitude than at sea level. Not by much, I don't know, a millionth of a second over 100,000 years or something like that. But they're different, right? And exactly according to Einstein's equations. In fact, I think it was in the 70s, the U.S. Navy took these atomic clocks and they put them on airplanes and they flew around the globe. And they flew one westward, I think, and it lost time relative to a stationary atomic clock, and they flew it around the world eastward, and it gained time in comparison to the non-motionary clock standard there, and it was all exactly according to Einstein's equations, right? So even time is relative, and where we get E equals mc squared and all of that. That's where you get big old nuclear explosions or power plants and all of that because of the relativity of these atomic principles. So Einstein, you know, in the early 20th century, started proposing his theories of relativity. And they're one of the things that he hated, if I understand properly, he hated about his understanding of this world that we live in called everything is relative, was that he knew that it implied the universe had a beginning. Every secular, scientific, and philosophical viewpoint up until then wanted to have an eternal universe. It just is. The stuff that's in it, it figured out a way to happen by itself. But the universe itself, the container and everything in it, is always eternal. It's just always been. As we'll find out tonight as well, that's not even logical in its own attempt to make a statement here. But Einstein recognized it, and he even tried to create this what he called himself a fudge factor. Try to create this fudge factor to say, well, maybe the universe didn't have a beginning if we just do this to the formulas that I've proven to be true. And he later called it the biggest blunder of his career, trying to get a universe that doesn't have a finite beginning. Okay, so what we see here is that Einstein, and through other approaches to this, we recognize that in the beginning of our world that we live in, remember we live in this cause and effect world, there was nothing, no time, no space, no matter, no energy. Now, what your materialistic, atheistic, evolutionary thought process is, first there was nothing, and then suddenly it exploded. Wait a minute, well, what exploded? Nothing. And literally nothing. Now, we might think of like, okay, well, time and space must surely have always existed. It's just the matter and stuff in the... No. Time, space, matter, and energy, all, according to Einstein, and through all other forms of scientific investigation, had a simultaneous beginning. Space and time are connected. Most scientists call it space-time, because space and time are connected. It's not just a convention saying, well, let's count time in 24-hour days and 60-minute hours and 60-minute minutes and all that, 60-second minutes. It's actual time. And the universe has its own clock, and time itself had a beginning. And before, we don't know we have to ask God at some point, what was there before you created time, space, matter, and energy? We don't know. But we do know that the universe we live in had a simultaneous beginning of all time, space, matter, and energy. Okay. So literally nothing means nothing. No fundamental particles, no quarks, no empty space, no energy source. Nothing means nothing. Close your mind and think about nothing. You can't, what would it look like? We don't even know, right? We have no idea what nothing but means nothing. But nothing is what we started with. And then suddenly we have something. Okay. So then suddenly, not that long ago really, suddenly space, time, matter, and energy simultaneously came to be out of the nothingness that preceded them. This becomes what is referred to as the cosmological argument, or sometimes called the Kalam cosmological argument. That starts on page 75 of the book. Okay. And once again, because we've now been equipped with this understanding of using logical and reason and inductive reasoning, okay, we say everything that had a beginning had to have a cause. Okay. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe that we live in had a cause that brought it into existence. Proposition 1 is everything that has a cause had a beginning, or everything that had a beginning had a cause that caused it to begin. The universe meets that criteria. It had a beginning, according to Einstein and many secular scientists who have no relationship to a religious system other than their own secular humanism. Therefore, however, the universe had to have something that caused it. I think I probably mentioned this last week, but we talked about, well, this universe has this cause. There's people out there thinking about this universe-generating machine somewhere out there that creates all these multiverses, and we just happen to be one of billions or trillions of multiverses that have been generated into existence. But of course, that all that does, like most things, is kick the can down the road a little bit, and then now we have to ask, where did the universe-generating machine come from? How did it get into existence? It had a cause. Something caused it to come. Right. So it doesn't answer any questions. And so thinking about the unthinkable, like multiverses and all of that, doesn't change the laws of logic and reason. The universe that we live in had a cause. What was its cause? And if something caused it to happen, well, what caused that? Okay. And we can say the same thing. That's where we get to, like, people talk about biological life. Well, where did life come from? And we figured, all scientists, biologists have all figured out you cannot get life from non-life. Right? So what do? Do they turn to God? Well, most of them don't. They turn to aliens and say, aliens, whether it's intentional or unintentional, sent the material for life to get started here on Earth. But again, it kicks the can down the road, and you say, where did those aliens get life? How did they get started? Oh, well, there was aliens that started them. Okay, well, let's stop the infinite regression, and let's get back to what started the first thing in the universe. Okay, something else outside the universe had to start it. So the law of causality, cause and effect, affirms that premise one, everything that had a beginning had a cause. This is the fundamental principle of science. Without it, science and scientific discovery would be impossible. We would have there would be no such thing as an employed scientist, because if you don't live in a cause and effect universe, you don't have any ability to do scientific investigation. Okay, what do? They try to eliminate, isolate all the variables, so they can turn one variable and see if that variable creates some kind of change that they either predicted or it falsifies their hypothesis in some way. Right? Science itself is simply just a search for knowledge, a search for causes. So anybody who denies the law of causality is really denying rational thinking. Okay? But again, Einstein has already helped us to understand we live in a universe that had time, space, matter, and energy, had a single point of beginning. Some people say it was 14 billion years ago. Some people say it was 6,000 years ago. But either way, you have a beginning, and that requires a beginner. So the book presents these 5 lines of evidence. They put it in an acronym. They want you to memorize it. I'll just say I'm not super impressed with this area of the book. So one area of the book that because I've studied this stuff so extensively, I don't really jump into it where they do. But they talk about S as the second law of thermodynamics. It's the law of entropy, the law of decay, that everything in the universe tends towards disorder. Okay? And we see that in anything that we do. These chairs in this church right now, somebody tried to set them all in straight lines in order, but guess what? You can look around and go, some of them are starting to move away from that order, right? They're a little bit out of place. Second law of thermodynamics says that everything in the universe, if it started at a single point of beginning, it starts to wind down. The sun will eventually burn up. The planets will eventually stop rotating and will burn up. And the universe ultimately will suffer a heat death where all useful energy is consumed and there's nothing left. It's never going back. It's not going to have a time where it winds itself back up. All it can do is wind down. They also talk about this expanding universe and Hubble's law, the red shift, and all of that. If you've heard of those things, they look at it and say the universe is expanding. Expanding universe implies that it started someplace smaller, and of course it's getting bigger because it's expanding. So it tends to point towards a beginning, a point of beginning. And then cosmic radiation background, CMB I should say, cosmic background radiation. They predicted that there should be this signature of radiation throughout the galaxy, throughout the universe, and then they tried to figure it out, and they came up with, yes, there does seem to be radiation that's predictable from the Big Bang. Galaxy seeds and the planting of stars in the galaxies and all of that, it goes through this whole lengthy discussion on that. It's not something I buy into or whatever, because I think, from my research, my authors that I have great respect for, Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, I think they are old Earth and even incorporate some evolutionary concepts into their thinking. Doesn't discount the rest of the book for me, but their sciencey stuff is not particularly impressive to me. And then they go to Einstein's theory of relativity and the beginning. So they use this SURGE acronym. If you like it, if you find value in it, if you're reading the book, then go for it. What I put up here is kind of my life over the last 28 years. Just sampling, it's actually not even all of it. I've got all kinds of books, Noah's Flood, In the Beginning. Here's a book called Trace from Nathaniel Jeanson, who predicted that all human beings on the planet go back to the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and he's proven that seems to be the evidence that we see. He also wrote a book called Replacing Darwin. Everything you see that I'm presenting to you here is, generally speaking, from a young Earth, like 6,000-year creation viewpoint, sciencey stuff. Douglas Axe wrote a book called Undeniable, that we see the evidence of design in everything in the universe. All these different things. J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case detective, set out to figure out whether Christianity is true, and proved, to himself and then hopefully to others that all the evidence points to the reality of the truth of the scriptures. And then, I can't even tell you how many hours of DVDs and stuff that I've got here that all talk about, if you're interested, there's incredible levels of evidence that support what I believe is the actual reality of life that we live in, that we have a young earth, a young creation, 6,000 or so years, that evolution is not even possible. I could talk about some of these things. Einstein clearly proved the beginning of the earth or universe. There's so many evidences. There's hundreds, really, of evidences of a young earth, not an old earth. Okay, including things like the salinity level of the oceans, right? If the oceans were continuing for billions of years to get more and more salty, they should be significantly more salty than they are. We talk about things like moon dust. When they flew the Apollo missions to the moon, they thought they were going to find miles thick of dust, because all it does is collect. It never sheds. There's no atmosphere, so it just simply gravitationally pulls in a bunch of dust. And they actually thought they would find miles deep dust before you got to hard surface of the moon, and they found less than an inch when they got there. There's just dozens and dozens and dozens of proofs, if you will, or strong suggestions that we live in a young earth. Biologically, talk about the animal kinds and the plant kinds. Everything's based on, Darwin was envisioning this super simple cell. Didn't even know what it was, but it was, whatever that simple cell is, it's got to be it's just protoplasm. It just got nothing in it, but it comes together, and suddenly you get hearts and lungs and eyes and all this kind of stuff somehow. When we look into the structure of a cell, we see the incredible level of complexity, and it's all built on a digital code of the DNA, and the DNA never shows that it adds new information. All it can ever do is subtract information. Okay, like you've heard of disease or what is it? Not chemical, drug-resistant bacteria. Heard of those kind of things, right? Drug-resistant bacteria. Drug-resistant bacteria can happen. It's part of the design that God has built into things, where these bacteria can actually start pitching out parts that are going to harm them if this drug comes in, or this antibiotic or whatever comes into them. It can start pitching out materials and say, well, I can survive if I get rid of all this stuff. But what does it do? It makes itself have less ability to survive in the long run. Okay. And so it never adds new information. All it does is subtract. So you could take a picture or walk up here or ask me to borrow something. I've got all kinds of stuff out on loan. But I just don't think that Geisler and Turek have necessarily a particularly robust description of the science that declares the truth and authority of God's word and the actual reality that we live in. Their attempt is to say the evidence that we see points to God, and I agree with that. I just think their attempts to marry a little bit of biblical thinking with secular science that denies God is probably not particularly helpful there in chapter 3. Bill.
Dr. Michael B., he talks about the human eye.
Yep.
And that gives evolution its real fit, because it's just so incredibly complex.
Right.
And you need everything at once
Mm-hmm.
to make it an eye.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't evolve without the necessity of the whole system.
Yeah. The eye, the ear, all of these, we'll talk about some of these things in here. But yeah, that's true. There's, he's now recently gone to be with the Lord, but there's a medical, actually, he was a medical doctor who was an anatomist with answers in Genesis. His name is Mike, not Denton. Gosh, I just lost his name. Anyway, you can search YouTube, or there's a couple other places you can get it. He's got the hearing, ear, and the seeing eye as a video series out there. It's not like the most like, wow, the best graphics and the best this and that and the other thing. It's incredible. I mean, the complexity of the ear is incredible. Okay, the human ear is absolutely incredible, and the technology and the engineering of the human eye is absolutely like knock your socks off. You can't believe it. So if you want to take some time, it's a great video. Like I said, it's good. It's not like watching, you know, a well-produced movie, if you will. But it's super good information. So it's called The Hearing Ear and the Seeing Eye. If you want to look at that, David Minton, Dr. David Minton is his name. Minton, M-E-N-T-E-N or O-N. I think it's Ian. So really good, excellent stuff. Okay, so I'm going to just move on past that. I've got some other stuff here at the back end. We'll see if we get to it today. So the conclusion, that's jumping to the end of chapter 3 here. The conclusion of a finite universe is no longer in question. Really, all scientists, all philosophers, all atheists, generally speaking, if they study this at all, understand that we don't live in an infinite universe. We live in a finite universe. So the implication of this truth has spawned a great deal of atheistic speculation to avoid the obvious implications. However, no atheistic theory adequately refutes the conclusion that the universe was caused to exist by a supernatural creator or being who pre-existed the universe. Okay. So, scientists and philosophers and other noted thinkers who reject the truth that the universe had come into existence as a result of a supernatural being who created it are doing so as an act of will, not as an objective attempt to find out the facts and the reality of life. The evidence is objective. The disbelieving scientists who refuse to accept the conclusions are not being objective when they deny that a universe that had a beginning must have had something that began it, meaning God. Okay. And then we even get to this. Our timeline is undeniably finite, meaning time itself is limited. Time itself had a beginning. Now, this is where you get into even math. I don't know if you have any mathematician-type folks in here. Well, I know we have one. But mathematician-type stuff, okay, objectively, there could never have been an infinite number of days. You don't have to have gone through all of Einstein's theories and all that. All you have to do is say there's no such thing as infinity. There's absolutely in our universe, now with God there is, but that's outside of our universe. With our universe, there's no such thing as an infinite number of days. Because if you had an infinite number of days, you'd never get to today. Okay? If something like a new day, like today or tomorrow, could be added to infinity, then you didn't start with infinity. Because infinity means it goes from forever on the right and forever on the left, or whichever way I'm looking at it now. Right? It goes as far and far and far. It never, ever, 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 ever ends. So how do you add another day to it? You never get to today if you can't get to the starting point. There's no starting point. You can't possibly get to today. So the fact that tomorrow will add another day to the history of the universe is substantial proof all by itself that the universe cannot be eternal or infinite. Right? Because we're adding days every single, and time is real. It's not just some fabricated thought process. We're actually experiencing the passage of time throughout the entire universe. And as that time passes, you can't possibly have started in infinity in the back and get to today. Because then it wouldn't be infinite. Well, then suddenly you've just destroyed any claims that the universe is infinite as soon as you have another day. You have to be somewhat of a mathematician to try and start figuring that stuff out. But just remember, infinity really means infinity. Just like nothing really means nothing, right? There's just nothing, nothing, nothing. Well, in the same way, infinity means it never, ever, 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 ever ends in that direction, and it never, ever, 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 ever ends in that direction, so you can't add anything to it. It's impossible, because it's already infinite. The conclusion, then, on the cosmological argument is that the cosmological argument is true because both of the premises are true. Everything that comes into being must have a cause. The universe clearly came into existence. So it must have had a beginning. Our universe must have had a beginning. So it must have had a beginner. We haven't defined what the beginner is, but a universe must have had a beginning. Which brings up the question, who made God? Page 92, 93. I think everybody probably who starts to question, is there a God, is there not a God, or believe in God, but where did God come from? Who made God? Pages 92 and 93 are out there. Is a question that confirms our commitment to the law of causality. Let's just right up front say, the moment a child or an adult says, well, who made God? How did God come into being? Right? Well, then suddenly we're affirming the law of causality. We recognize that we live in a cause and effect universe. Everything we experience in this universe that has a cause had a precedent, or as an effect, has a preceding cause that started it. So the question then is God caused or uncaused? Again, we're back to logic. There is no other option. God is either an uncaused being or someone or something caused God to exist, but God is eternal and requires no precedent cause. Otherwise, by definition, he's God. Right? If someone created God, then God, what we call God is not actually God. Whoever created God is actually God. What are we doing? We're kicking the can back down the road again, because somehow the whole thing had to get started, and so we're not interested in the intermediate, who made this God and who made that God. We're interested, who started it all, and that's the God we're really talking about. Yeah. Man in our image? Yeah. It means the Trinity. It's an allusion or a reference to the Trinity, and it starts right there in what you're quoting from Genesis chapter 1. Okay, and so what we see, this is outside of the scope of here, but I would love to talk to you about it, and that is, so we see from the very first verse of the Bible, okay, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The word there in Hebrew for God is actually plural. Okay. And it's plural. There's a plurality of the being, the existence of God. What's interesting, though, is that plural noun for Elohim, for God, is always used with a singular verb. Like we have in English rules of grammar, you use singular verbs with singular nouns and plural with plural. Our image, and we suddenly start seeing that we are made in the image of God. And then throughout the rest of Scripture, it's not that it's not God having a conversation with the angels. He's not turning to the angels and saying, hey, angels, let's make man in our image, because angels aren't made in the image of God. The only beings that in the Bible that are made in the image of God are human beings. So he's talking to himself. Let us make man in our image is another statement of the plurality of God, one God in three persons. And that whole thing, that whole statement of the Trinity continues to develop throughout the rest of Scripture. There's many other places in the Old Testament that refer to God in more than one person. And then you certainly see it in the New Testament, where Jesus is referred to as God, the Holy Spirit is referred to as God, and God the Father is referred to as God. One God, three persons. Make sense? Good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, he did. He absolutely began. He pre-existed. He became incarnate as a human being. He added humanity to what he already existed. But he was in the beginning with God, and through him all things were made that were made. John chapter 1, right? Yeah. And so, and like he tells the Pharisees who are challenging him in John chapter 8, right? Before Abraham was, I am. right? I existed not just when Abraham existed, I existed before Abraham was even, any human beings ever existed. I exist. And so Christ, as the second member of the Trinity, has always existed. But he was begotten in the sense of became a human being in addition to his divinity in what we see in the Gospels 2,000 years ago. That help? Yeah. Again, we have to remember in all of these kind of concepts that a God that's understandable enough to completely be understood by our own minds is not big enough to be the God of the universe. We'll never truly understand the character, nature, glory, power, all that God is. We can only understand and comprehend what he's revealed to us about himself. He's revealed to himself that he's eternal. He's revealed to himself that he's all-powerful. He's revealed to himself that he has all knowledge, all wisdom. And so he's revealed that stuff to us. And when Moses asks, in Exodus chapter 3, he says, who shall I say that you are? He says, I exist. The God who created everything, the God who is, I created everything. Moses, how do you want me to answer your question? I exist. I'm the only thing that makes sense because I actually exist. Without him pre-existing everything, nothing else makes sense because you're always looking for that what caused the effect. God is sometimes referred to as the uncaused first cause. Right? He's the uncaused, because he exists in himself, cause of everything that follows from him. Okay. So God is eternal, and therefore, we can't keep kicking the can down the road. We have to have something that's eternal. We have to have something that has the power to exist within itself for anything to exist. Anything. Because we recognize we live in this cause and effect universe, and we all want to know, well, where did that come from, and where did that come from, and where did that come from, and we keep going back and back and back. Eventually, you have to get to a starting point, and that starting point has to pre-exist everything. Logically, the only way. And so it's interesting that logic matches perfectly with God's self-attestation in Scripture. I exist, and logically, we need something that pre-existed everything in order for anything else to exist. So, anyway, get a little bit ahead of the logic and the development here. All right. So, if the universe is not eternal, right, but we know that it's definitely not eternal, then by necessity, something outside the universe must be eternal. We don't, logically, we're not trying to present God yet. We just have to say something out there, that multiverse generator, if you want to fall into that category, or God, or some other entity or something, has to be existent before everything else, eternal. Because we know the world, the universe that we live in, had a beginning. Time, space, matter, energy, all had a beginning. So what began it? Something outside of it had to. Something must be eternal, because you can't get something out of nothing. Something has to be there. And if nothing's there, then nothing can come from it. But something had to exist before everything else. Science, logic, reason, without relying on claims from Scripture yet in our development of our study here, demand the first cause to be. This is, like I said, what are the resume requirements of this first cause? Don't need the Bible. Okay, we just need logic, inductive reasoning, and logic, all those things to say, what do we need to get the universe started? We know it had a beginning. Everybody agrees now it had a beginning. What would be the characteristics of that which started the universe we have? We'd have to be self-existent, because other than that, if you need somebody to start you, well, then you need somebody to start them, and you need somebody to start them. Keep going back until you get to a self-existent entity. Must be timeless, because they're not bound by time, space, matter, and energy within the universe they created. Must be non-spatial, right? Not bound up in material things. Must be immaterial. The first cause must be without limits. By it himself or itself, it must be infinite, because you can't add anything to it. He's created it all. This is just logic demanding that this is what the creator or that which created the universe would look like or have. Number 2, unimaginably powerful. This universe is incredibly large. The sun, just our own teeny tiny little sun compared to most other suns or many other suns or stars in the universe is just, I mean, the power that emits from this is just incredible. Okay, so in order for him to create all of that or put that into existence, he must have far more power than that to be able to bring it all into existence. And because we're, as we'll look at here in the next session, he must be supremely intelligent because the universe screams design everywhere with incredible precision. We'll, again, talk about that later. What we'd also demand is it be personal, distinct, being without, a distinct being with a volition or a will. He has a purpose, he has a plan, he has a will. Not an impersonal, unintelligent force or, like dark matter. The science wants to say, oh, dark matter, it's that kind of the answer for everything. We don't know what we can't find it, but we can guess that it exists. You got dark matter, dark energy, all these things you can't measure, but that becomes their God because they're like, well, we'll just appeal to dark matter. We'll appeal to dark energy and figure out a way to get things to start in the universe. But that doesn't scream design. Everything we have in the universe that we see, from the smallest to the largest, screams intelligent design and purpose. So, he would have purpose, he would have a will, and created all that we observe. Okay? Impersonal forces, like dark matter, dark energy, don't have choices. They don't make choices. They just are. But we see throughout the universe, the observable evidence shows intelligence, purpose, design. So the most reasonable conclusion to the evidence that the universe had a beginning is that God exists. There is no other rational explanation that can explain the existence of everything. All attempts by atheists to assert that the uncaused first cause is not God are futile. They have no facts, they have no evidence to explain away God from reality. There's just, we recognize we live in this closed system, a universe. It has time, space, matter, and energy. It's incredibly vast. It's incredibly got a huge, vast amount of potential and realized energy in it. How do you explain all that? And they appeal to all kinds of things, right? They appeal to aliens. They appeal to multiverse generators. They appeal to Big Bang explosions. But they don't have any evidence. And all it is just a replacement for God. What's your God? It's the Big Bang. What's your God? It's dark matter. What's your God? It's a multiverse generator. I mean, they want to call it something other than God because everything I just named will never hold anybody accountable for their sins. God, if we get to that point, does hold people accountable for their sins. So they're willing to put trust in aliens. They're willing to put trust in multiverse generators. They're willing to put trust in I don't know, something exploded and suddenly everything came into existence. But they're not willing to put their faith in God because God means accountability. God means submitting to his authority. And these people who hold these views do not want to submit to the God that must have created them by objective, rational thought and reasoning behind it. All right, so I'm going to run through this fairly quickly. I've used this for years. Like I said, I've kind of, not trying to brag or do anything like that, just studied all kinds of stuff over decades. Here's what I would say is we're talking about this whole how to get things started within the universe. Here's what I have listed out as what I think are required miracles of evolution. When I say miracle, I mean I'm actually using the scientific definition. Scientific definition of a miracle, meaning the impossible, but maybe possibly somehow it could happen. They use an equation of 10 to the 50th power, meaning a number with 50 zeros after it. Okay, anything that has a probability of happening by chance with more than 50 zeros after it is considered absurd and a miracle. And virtually everything that I'm going to present to you here is way worse than that. Not just 50 zeros. We're talking thousands of zeros or millions of zeros of super infinitely small probabilities. Okay, so their first miracle is out of nothing, matter, space, time, and energy all somehow sprang into existence without any kind of aid from anything outside force. Matter in an infinitely small ball is the Big Bang theory here. At the center of the universe exploded and expanded into the universe without any kind of outside energy source to cause the explosion. much less where did the material come from. Requires a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. If you don't know what that is, that means it's called the conservation of matter and energy. We can't create matter and we can't destroy matter. All we can do is convert matter into energy. Okay? And so we say all that we have in the universe is all we'll ever get. We're not going to get any more matter. We're not going to get any more energy. All we can do is play with its configuration. So it violates that because how do you get, somehow we got it. Where did it come from? Violates the second law of thermodynamics. That's that entropy law, that everything is winding down. Yet somehow they're saying at the beginning it wound up, and then it started winding down. But their own law says, no, everything winds down. You see, for life to exist, like if you heard of like the Urey Miller experiment where they, quote, created life in a test tube, complete fabrication, complete cheating of the process. You'll notice they always exclude oxygen from their test tubes and whatever they were doing because you can't have oxygen in it. But the second, the microsecond you have life, you better have oxygen because all life requires oxygen. So you have this, gosh, you have to have oxygen in order for life. You can't have oxygen for the parts of life to spring to life. So you also see this, all this like this primordial goop and soup that's out there. You have to have ammonia-rich. It has to be a very ammonia-rich atmosphere for these building blocks of life to come together. That's why it has to be done in a test tube. It's not done in the world because the world is hostile to these formations of life. Also have to have methane-rich atmosphere. Hydrogen has to be highly available, readily available, and it wouldn't be in the Earth's atmosphere. DNA and protein. I mean, well, if you don't know, you can't produce protein without DNA. All protein comes at the instruction of DNA building protein. However, DNA itself is made up of protein. So how do you get DNA without protein, or how do you get protein without DNA? A violation of the law of mass action just says that chemical reactions, there's this law of mass action where the chemicals that want to bind together will do so readily, and that is they're requiring that chemicals that don't want to bind together are the ones we need to bind together to get life. Okay? In incredibly long chains of like amino acids that never, ever, ever want to bind together. Violation of chemical equilibrium, like water is the universal solvent. These chemicals, and like they talk about like monkeys at the typewriter, right? You've heard these kind of things. Monkeys at the typewriter will produce all the works of Shakespeare and the Bible and all these things if you just keep on typing. Well, the problem is they type, in the real world that we live in, they type things in, and as soon as they take their hands off the keyboard, they untype themselves. These chemical reactions, they might bind together for a microsecond, but then the law of equilibrium says, no, they actually prefer not to be bound together. And so they unbind more readily than they bind together. But you need to bind hundreds of precise amino acids together just to get the start of the DNA protein working. Amino acids, asking that these amino acids would form in a watery environment. Doesn't happen. They don't like to do that. Chirality, left-handed, right-handed, they got all these things. They have to be precise in order to make it work. All these, again, super technical terms like non-performance of biochemical reaction just says it's impossible. And you always hear this, infinity. Given enough time, anything can happen, right? They say anything can happen given enough time. Actually, time is the enemy of every one of these processes because time, because of the second law of thermodynamics, will tend to force them to decay and destruct, not to increase in complexity, not to increase in design and order. So every single one of these requires a statistical miracle. There's not a single piece of evidence that supports these theories. Every part of it is entire conjecture, from the Big Bang explosion that started the universe, supposedly, from the primordial soup that sprang somehow abiogenesis into life. No evidence, requires a miracle, and then every transitional form to get from single cell to multi-cell and all these things, there's still no evidence after hundreds of years or more than 150 years of searching for it, and there's still no evidence for any transitional forms. And every single one of them would require a miracle for them to come into or change from one form to another. because it would violate that DNA principle that it's a digital code. Every single living thing has a DNA digital code, and you can't get from point A to point B. You can't get from reptile to bird with the DNA that they have. You need different DNA to make it work. Atomic stability, every single multi-component organ in a living system. We talked about the eye. How do you get the eye to function? Through intermediate steps like Darwin proposed. Digestive system. How do you get something that lives without being able to bring in energy from the outside world, process that energy, and then expend the waste of unconsumed material? All that, whether it's a single cell or a human being, you still need the same systems to function and work, or you don't have life. Brain. Do you realize an ant is doing more calculations as it moves every single one of its legs and moves its head and looks through its eyes? It's doing more calculations than the most powerful computer on the planet in order to live, in order to function. Nervous system, circulatory system, respiratory system, reproductive system. Even if you got some miracle happening where this creature turned from an amphibian to a reptile, it needs somebody to mate with that has the same compatibility with it. So you get one accident, that's a supposed accident that happens, you get some, gecko or whatever out there, and now it's looking around for somebody to mate with. And if it doesn't find somebody to mate with, the fact that it became a gecko dies within this single generation, right? You have to have a reproductive system and compatibility with the mate to make that work. Sonar systems, incredibly complex with bats and dolphins and all these kind of things. We talked about last week, I'll probably finish with this, I think we're almost done anyway, anthropic principle. All of these incredibly knife-edge fine-tuning of the universe. Most of this may not mean anything to you. I'm just going to read through it. Stability of the proton. Stability of the proton. So scientists today still don't know why atoms are held together. They say it requires some force from outside the atom, actually probably from outside the universe, to hold the atoms together, but we don't know what it is. The size of our sun, the color of our sun, the age of the sun, the mass of the sun, the distance of the Earth from the sun, the surface gravity of the Earth, the thickness of our Earth's crust, the rotation on a 24-hour period. If it was slower, we'd have ice ages. We would never, ever get out of ice cycles. If it was faster, we would not have a stable water supply or a consistent water supply. Gravitational interaction between the Earth and the moon. It's super important that the Earth and the moon are in the relationship they are. The size of the moon, the size of the Earth, all these things are super important. The magnetic field that protects us from all of this interstellar radiation stuff that happens out there, it's so designed for us to have life here. The tilt of the Earth, that 23-degree tilt of the Earth is vital. We wouldn't have life without the right tilt of the Earth. The reflectivity, the amount of sunlight that penetrates but also reflects back is perfect. The oxygen to nitrogen ratio within the Earth's atmosphere is super important. Carbon dioxide and water vapor levels. Without it, you don't have life. The entropy levels of how it's not any faster, that we're not winding down any faster. The mass of the universe, the number of stars in the universe, the ozone layer, all of these things are precise to the point where if you change it in like a tenth of a fraction of a percent, most everything else falls apart and dies. You start to see there's all kinds of issues with this a spark and soup kind of experiments to get life or a big bang to get the universe. And then we have some of these, what you might call chicken and egg problems, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, which came first? The hypothesized primordial goo that needed the oxygen for life, but oxygen would destroy life, the building blocks. So how do you get there? It's a chicken and egg. Do you have an oxygen-free environment, or do you have an oxygen-rich environment? I don't know why that's so small. Did DNA protein, we talked about DNA. Did you get DNA from protein, or do you get protein from DNA? How did you manage that? And all these long periods of time. You have to have long periods of time to make evolution work. But if you have long periods of time, it will destroy the evolutionary processes. Because time is destructive. Time is the enemy, even though they want time to be their ally. So there's your science chapter, if you will, on all of this. This is like trying to go through and say, what makes the most sense? We're looking again, conclusion here. The box top of life. Does the box top of life scream God or a source that brought everything into existence? Or does it seem like randomness, accident, chance, explosions, no purpose, no intelligence behind it all? Everything seems to scream God is the cause, the uncaused first cause that brought everything into existence, and we have to look at it from an objective standpoint and say the evidence leads me to conclude that I don't have enough faith to believe it happened by chance or accident. Yeah. So with that, we'll continue on next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.